In the family memories that Thérèse, her mother, and her sisters recalled in their correspondence and memoirs, Thérèse identifies herself as a moral agent from childhood. Zélie's letters are an especially rich source of anecdotes from this first period of Thérèse's life, and in one letter to her daughter Pauline, she writes about Céline and Thérèse together, happily playing and talking about spiritual matters. Marie, the oldest sister, had given Céline and Thérèse each a chaplet to keep track of good deeds they had performed, and Zélie writes that, quote, "The most charming thing of all is to see Thérèse slip her hand into her pocket time and time again and move a bead along as she makes some sacrifice." Since Thérèse was only 4 at the time of her mother's death, she must have been very young when this particular incident occurred. But Zélie writes as if this were not unusual conversations and practices for her daughters. Day notes that in her time, as in ours, Catholic children made their first communion and first confession together around age 7. However, in Thérèse's time, first communion happened at a later date, and children could go to confession whenever their elders felt that they were ready. It is a testament to Thérèse's family that they recognized her early spiritual and moral awareness and began letting her go to confession at the age of 5. Thérèse always had a keen moral sense and a strong conscience, which her family did not try to blunt. She was quick to rectify her small errors and try to make things right if she had displeased someone else in the household. Day writes, quote, "They always helped her try to do the hard thing, the more perfect thing, not to justify herself when she was accused, not to complain when things were taken from her. She saw her own constant failures." Thérèse, who felt that no one who was in a state of grace need have any fear at all, and who knew God as endlessly, boundlessly merciful, loved to receive the sacrament of reconciliation, and she went on the eve of all the great feasts of the Church. Thérèse had a strong sense of her own weakness and felt all her life that the reason she had never fallen into serious sin was because God wouldn't let her. God removed every serious temptation from her path in advance. In spite of that, Thérèse still had the normal capacity for venial sin, imperfections, etc. that we all have. In a previous lecture, we discussed the intense longing for love and intimacy that Thérèse experienced during her years at school. She desired to devote herself to various classmates and teachers. She wanted to become a martyr, like the saints of the early church. Thérèse may have been shielded from every opportunity for mortal sin, but Dorothy writes, "What youth has ever been lonely and apart and far from the world of glitter and glamour and excitement and joy, without wishing that the opportunities of choice between sin and virtue, between good and evil, might come to him?" Day reflects, this might be a temptation of youth deprived of the opportunity of greater choices, but it may also be the great hunger of a woman who feels her capacity for human love. This capaciousness is typical of the type of person who becomes a saint, and perhaps Day recognized something of her own younger self in the adolescent Thérèse. When Thérèse speaks of capacity for sin, it is, quote, "an immense capacity at that, as immense as her capacity for love. She had plumbed the heights and the depths, this child." The family culture in which Thérèse was formed honored not only spiritual childhood, but actual childhood, seeing very young girls as capable of genuine theological reflection and moral decision-making. In this environment, Thérèse, writes Day, was beginning even at that very early age to see what the spiritual life meant, the series and successions of definite choices, the preferences, which means that the life of love, the ordering of every little thing, as though we were practicing the presence of God. Day wants to impress upon her readers the significance of the present moment, how every act is a chance to bring more of God's peace to a world in need. By respecting her spiritual and moral capacities from her earliest years, Thérèse's mother and older sisters helped her to develop this awareness of the potential and potency of each moment, each small act, an awareness that Day recognizes as a sign of holiness. In encouraging her growth in moral and spiritual awareness, Thérèse's family assisted her in developing a strong and informed conscience. As an anarchist and pacifist, The primacy of conscience as a moral authority was a foundational principle for Day. In every case, Day counseled those who came to her for advice on difficult subjects, such as registering for the draft, voting, or paying federal taxes, to follow their conscience, even when they came to different conclusions than she had. Following the promulgation of the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, or Gaudium et Spes, during the Second Vatican Council, Day wrote in her December 1965 column, "I always felt, with St. Francis of Assisi, that we do not know what we have not practiced, and that we learn by our actions, even when those actions involve us in grave mistakes or sin. God brings good out of evil, that evil which has come about of our free will, our free choice. We learn, as the saying is, the hard way, but the promise is there. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you." And to repeat again, since there is no time with God, the promise, the finding, and the seeking go together, even when one is following a wrong or ill-informed conscience. For me, this answers the question as to whether we at the Catholic Worker think that a man is in a state of mortal sin for going to war. I have often been asked this question by students that I feel we must keep on trying to answer, faulty and obscure as the answer that each one of us makes may seem to be. To my mind, the answer lies in the realm of the motive, the intention. If a man truly thinks he is combating evil and striving for the good, if he truly thinks he is striving for the common good, he must follow his conscience, regardless of others. But he always has the duty of forming his conscience by studying, listening, being ready to hear his opponent's point of view, by establishing what Martin Buber calls an I-thou relationship. Over the years, Day frequently found herself at odds with the state, as well as the teaching authority of the Church on matters of state-sponsored violence. Day took seriously the role of the laity in leading the transformation of society towards justice and solidarity. The principle she held for herself and for the Catholic worker movement would not enter the official magisterium until decades later. Official recognition of conscientious objection to a specific war or to all war as a licit option for lay Catholics did not exist in the early 1940s when the United States entered World War II, and Day published a column titled, "Our country passes from undeclared war to declared war. We continue our Christian pacifist stance." "We are still pacifists," she wrote. "Our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, which means that we will try to be peacemakers. Speaking for many of our conscientious objectors, we will not participate in armed warfare or in making munitions or in buying government bonds to prosecute the war or in urging others to these efforts." Conscientious objection is now protected by the magisterium, in large part to the activity of lay movements like the Catholic Worker, the Catholic Peace Fellowship, and the Ecumenical Fellowship of Reconciliation over the course of the 20th century. Nuclear war has been condemned by international bishops' conferences, and the Vatican and documents of the Catholic social tradition, from Gaudium et Spes through Fratelli Tutti, display an increasing preference for nonviolence and just peace over just war as the appropriate Christian response to conflict. The Catechism of the Catholic Church was updated in 2018 to declare the death penalty inadmissible in all cases. We know that doctrine, especially social doctrine, develops over time, but for Day, one's conscience, improved through intellectual preparation, the practice of the works of mercy, and the operation of the Holy Spirit, was to be obeyed even before these principles were officially adopted by the magisterium. In her Life of Thérèse, Day recounts two instances where Thérèse's own fidelity to conscience set her at odds with figures of authority in her family and in the Church. Soon after Thérèse became aware of God's call for her to enter the Lisieux Carmel, she felt a strong desire to bring souls to Christ. The 14-year-old Thérèse became aware of a condemned murderer, Pranzini, who had killed 3 people and was awaiting execution, by all accounts completely unrepentant. Thérèse was moved to pray for his conversion and asked God to move Pranzini to fling himself upon the divine mercy before his death. Pranzini was executed by guillotine on August 31st, 1887. Louis Martin did not allow his young daughters to read the newspaper, which would have been filled with lurid details of the public execution, but the next morning, Thérèse sought a newspaper out. "I did not consider it an act of disobedience on the day following the execution when I hastily opened the paper, Le Croix, and looked for the part concerning Pranzini," Thérèse later wrote. Immediately prior to his death, Pranzini had asked for a crucifix and had kissed the wounds of Christ 3 times. Thérèse understood then that her firstborn, as she called Pranzini, was safe in the arms of Jesus. Not long after that, Louis, Céline, and Thérèse set off on a pilgrimage to Rome. Thérèse's father and sisters by this time fully supported her early entry into Carmel, trusting her ability to hear and respond to God's call. Following their initial visit to the superior of the Carmelites, Louis had taken Thérèse to see the bishop, who had tried to convince her to stay home for a few more years. Louis made it clear that he would not stand in his daughter's way. Thérèse was going with him on a pilgrimage to Rome, and they would speak to the Pope himself if needed. The bishop then said that he would speak to the superior at Lisieux and would forward the answer to Rome so that they would have no delays. 3 days later, the Martin family set off. Louis had passed his love of travel on to his daughters, and by all accounts, Thérèse and Céline had a wonderful time sightseeing and adventuring. On November 20th, their party attended the papal mass of Pope Leo XIII and stayed for an audience. If Thérèse was to ask the Holy Father for permission to enter Carmel at 15, it would have to be now. Day tells us that, quote, rigid convention had always been observed at these audiences, and the members of the pilgrimage were permitted to come forward and bow their heads to the ground and kiss the white slipper of the seated Pope. The Vatican clergy had explicitly ordered the party to keep silence, but with her heart beating wildly, Thérèse turned to look at Céline. "Speak," her sister whispered, and the child spoke out bravely. "Most Holy Father, I want to ask a great favor." In reflecting on this moment, Day notes that Thérèse, quote, had taken liberties with the Pope that she would not have taken with her own father, and she had gone again church and state, one might say, disregarding the orders of the Vicar General. Thérèse pressed for an answer and ultimately had to be pulled off the Pope by 2 guards and another cleric. She had been told not to do any of this. But was she wrong? Did Thérèse sin through disobedience? Day says no. Quote, "There is no conscience in her mind of sinning," Day writes. "There was only the conviction of the primacy of conscience. Her first exercise of her own judgment in disobeying an order was at the time of the execution of Pranzini, the murderer, when she had read one of the forbidden daily newspapers to find out whether the condemned man had given any sign of repentance before he was put to death. Even so, should she not have, in both cases, simply prayed and waited? Again, Day says no, for Thérèse was eminently a child of common sense. She would use her reason as far as it would take her and then live by faith, abandoning herself to divine providence. She would work as though all depended on herself and pray as though all depended on God, as St. Ignatius advised. The moral discernment that Thérèse's family had nurtured in her early childhood had enabled her to hear her conscience speaking at these 2 critical moments. It was not a question of disobedience to church or state or even to her own father, but to a higher authority, Thérèse's own conscience. Day values the spirituality of the little way as a method of moral empowerment for the laity. On her writing desk at Mary House, Day kept a small statue of St. Joan of Arc. It may seem an odd choice, this martial saint who restored the French monarchy as a patroness and companion for the pacifist and anarchist Day. But Day's attraction to Joan was for her fidelity to conscience, her willingness to give her life in response to the call she discerned. Thérèse likewise had a great admiration for Joan, who was not beatified until after Thérèse's death. There are photographs of Thérèse dressed as Joan for a pageant in the Lisieux Carmel, and during her childhood, Thérèse's family read the life of Joan of Arc out loud together in the evenings, along with other devotional texts. It was, in fact, in reading about Joan that Thérèse received the grace of knowing that she was made for great things and that she herself would become a great saint. In Joan, Thérèse and Dorothy, I see women whom God called to three wildly different vocations, but who are united by their fidelity to what they heard in God's call. God speaks to us through our conscience and calls us to respond to the specificity of the present moment. In that same December 1965 column where she spoke about our duty to conscience, Day puts forward the teachings of St. Thérèse as a Christian response to the horrors of the American invasion of Vietnam, extreme wealth inequality in Latin America, and the violence of the Jim Crow regime in the United States. When a mother, a housewife, asks what she can do, one can only point to the way of St. Thérèse, that little way, so much misunderstood and so much despised. She did all for the love of God, Day writes. Thérèse began working for peace in her own heart and willing to love where love was difficult, and so she grew in love and so increased the sum total of love in the world, not to speak of peace, Day writes. Our own circumstances, wherever we are, bear the seeds of holiness within them, just below the surface. Our work in the here and now has the potential to be transformative. There is cosmic significance to the choices we make. The sense of awareness that enables us to understand ourselves as moral agents is a call to responsibility, in great as well as in small things.